Nobody in that office knew who they were really dealing with. To them, he was just the quiet single dad in the faded jacket, the one who packed his own lunch, left early for school pickups, and never said a word when they laughed behind his back. Easy to dismiss, easy to fire. So when she stood in front of the whole floor and let him go, she smiled like she'd won something. She had no idea what she'd just started, because the man she humiliated wasn't who she thought he was. And in less than 24 hours, the truth would walk through that door, and it would carry his name. Meridian Logistics occupied 11 floors of glass and steel in the heart of the city, the kind of building where the elevators moved in silence and the lobby smelled faintly of fresh flowers, replaced every Monday morning. It was the kind of place people either belonged to completely or barely survived in. Daniel Reyes had chosen for 3 years now to be the second kind, at least on the surface. He arrived every morning at 7:40, 20 minutes before his shift technically started, not because anyone required it, but because it gave him quiet time before the noise of the office swallowed the day whole. He wore the same 3 button-down shirts on rotation, a gray one, a navy one, and a faded blue one with a collar that had softened from years of washing. His shoes were practical, not fashionable. His badge read Gamin Coordinator, Logistics Division, and to anyone glancing at it, that was the whole story. Nobody looked twice at Daniel. That was exactly how he needed it. At home, in a modest 2-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from the office, he was somebody else entirely, or rather, he was simply himself, without the performance. He was Emma's father. 7 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, obsessed with a cartoon about a detective dog, and utterly unaware that her father's quiet mornings making her scrambled eggs and her quiet evenings doing homework at the kitchen table were the only 2 hours a day when Daniel Reyes wasn't, carrying the weight of something enormous. 3 years ago, Daniel's wife, Claire, had died of an aggressive illness that took her in 8 months, faster than any of the doctors expected, faster than Daniel had time to prepare for. Before she passed, she made him promise 2 things. The first was to raise Emma with laughter in the house, not grief. The second was harder to keep, though it took him almost a year to understand why she'd asked it. Claire's family had founded Meridian Logistics 2 generations back. Her grandfather built it out of a single delivery truck and a stubborn refusal to lose contracts to bigger companies. By the time Claire inherited her stake, quietly and privately, through a family trust that had never been publicized, Meridian had grown into a corporation worth billions, though she herself had chosen a life far from boardrooms, working instead as a school teacher, the job she loved, the job where she met Daniel. When she died, that ownership stake passed to Daniel, held through the same private trust, structured in a way that kept his name off any public filing. He hadn't asked for it. He hadn't wanted it. For months after her death, he barely looked at the paperwork the family lawyer sent him, unable to separate the weight of sudden wealth from the grief of losing her. But Claire's second request had been specific, almost eerily so, as though she'd known something he didn't yet understand about the company her family built. She'd asked him not to reveal what he now controlled. Not yet. She wanted him to see Meridian from the inside first, as an ordinary employee, before he ever stepped into a boardroom as its majority stakeholder. "You'll understand people better from the bottom floor than the top one," she'd told him, her voice thin but certain. "And when you're ready to walk in as who you really are, you'll know exactly why it matters." So Daniel took the modest admin coordinator job at Meridian's downtown office under a name that was technically his but disconnected from any of the trust filings, using a distant, lesser-known middle name that appeared nowhere in the corporate paperwork. He answered emails. He processed shipping documentation. He kept his head down. And slowly, without ever intending to, he became invisible in the exact way that let him see everything. He saw supervisors take credit for the ideas of employees too junior to push back. He saw a culture where kindness downward was rare and flattery upward was constant. And most of all, he saw Vanessa Cole. Vanessa had joined Meridian's logistics division as a regional VP 18 months earlier, brought in from a competitor with a reputation for efficiency that, on closer inspection, meant cutting corners and cutting people. She was sharp, undeniably capable in front of a slideshow, and deeply, almost instinctively, contemptuous of anyone she perceived as beneath her. Daniel, with his quiet demeanor, his modest wardrobe, his habit of leaving precisely on time to pick up his daughter from the after-school program, was exactly the kind of employee Vanessa had decided, without ever really looking at him, didn't matter. She called him the printer guy once in a meeting, not unkindly exactly, just carelessly, the way someone steps over a crack in the sidewalk without noticing it's there. She rerouted his projects to other staff members when she wanted results delivered with more visible flair. She scheduled last-minute meetings at 5:15 p.m., fully aware Daniel needed to leave by 5:02 to make it to Emma's pickup on time, and made pointed comments when he apologized for stepping out. Daniel absorbed all of it. Not because he was weak, but because he had made a promise, and because 3 years of watching Vanessa operate had taught him something Claire, perhaps, had hoped he would learn. That the people who abuse quiet power almost always do it in front of witnesses who are too afraid, or too used to it, to say anything. On a bright Tuesday morning in early spring, the kind of morning where sunlight cut clean lines through the office's floor-to-ceiling windows, an email went out to the entire logistics division. The board, Meridian's actual board of directors, rarely seen in person at the branch level, was coming for a quarterly performance review. Vanessa, ever attuned to opportunities for visibility, began planning her presentation before the email had finished loading. Daniel read the same email at his desk, and for the first time in 3 years, felt something tighten quietly in his chest. He knew who was on that board. He knew, better than anyone else in the building, exactly what quarterly review meant this time, because the board chair, the one person at Meridian who did know Daniel's real identity, who had personally overseen the transition of Claire's shares into the trust, had told him, weeks earlier, that this visit would be different. "It's time," the chair had said simply, over a phone call Daniel had taken standing on his apartment balcony, Emma's laughter drifting through the open window behind him. "Claire would want you to see this through before we make anything public. Just be there Tuesday. I'll handle the rest." Daniel hadn't known what the rest meant. He still didn't, not fully. But as he sat at his desk that Tuesday morning, watching Vanessa stride past in a sharp navy blazer, already rehearsing lines under her breath, he understood that whatever was coming, it was coming today. He just didn't yet know it would come wrapped in his own public humiliation. The morning moved the way important mornings always do in corporate buildings, too fast and too slow at once, adrenaline stretching some minutes and collapsing others. By 9, the entire logistics floor had been transformed. Conference rooms were double-booked and rebooked. Someone had been sent out for pastries nobody would actually eat. Vanessa moved through the space like a director on opening night, straightening name placards, rehearsing her opening remarks to no one in particular, occasionally stopping to critique someone's outfit or posture with the casual cruelty of someone who has never once considered how her words land. Daniel worked quietly at his desk, compiling the shipment data Vanessa had asked for the week before. Data he'd finished days ago but had learned to release in stages, because handing in work too early only invited Vanessa to find something else to criticize in the meantime. He kept his headphones in, not playing anything, just enough to signal he didn't want conversation. It rarely worked, but today it bought him an hour of peace before Vanessa's heels clicked to a stop directly behind his chair. "Daniel." She said his name the way she always did, as if it cost her something to remember it. "The board's arriving at 11. I need the Q1 shipment variance report finalized, and I need it not to look like it was made by someone who still uses a flip phone." A junior analyst 2 desks over, Priya, glanced up, then quickly back down at her screen. She'd worked beside Daniel long enough to recognize the particular flavor of Vanessa's insults, the way they always landed with just enough plausible deniability to avoid sounding like what they were. "It'll be ready by 10:30, Daniel said evenly, not looking up from his screen. "It better be. I'm not walking into that room looking unprepared because someone couldn't manage a spreadsheet." Vanessa was already turning away as she said it, already moving toward her next target, already forgetting Daniel existed the moment he was out of her direct line of sight, which was, in its own way, exactly how Daniel preferred it. He finished the report at 10:15, 15 minutes ahead of the deadline he'd invented for himself, and sent it to Vanessa without comment. She didn't thank him. She never did. What she did do 20 minutes later was walk past his desk with the printed report in hand, holding it slightly away from her body as though it might be contaminated, and announce to no one and everyone at once that she'd had to fix a few embarrassing errors before it was presentable. There were no errors. Priya, sitting close enough to have reviewed the same numbers herself the day before, opened her mouth slightly as if to say something, then closed it again. This was the unspoken rule of the floor. You didn't correct Vanessa in front of people, not if you wanted your next review to go smoothly. By 10:45, the tension in the office had turned electric. Word had spread that this wasn't a routine review, that this particular visit included not just the regional director, but members of Meridian's actual board of directors, a group most employees on the floor had never seen in person. Vanessa treated the news like oxygen. She'd been angling for a promotion to senior VP for over a year, and a flawless, visible performance today, in front of the people who actually controlled her future, was exactly the kind of opportunity she'd been waiting for. She needed someone to blame if anything went wrong. And more than that, in the particular ugly logic of people like Vanessa, she needed someone to elevate herself above, a visible contrast that would make her own competence look sharper by comparison. She'd used this tactic before, quietly humiliating a struggling coworker in a meeting to make her own polished delivery shine brighter next to it. Today, with the stakes higher than usual, she wanted a bigger stage for it. At 10:52, she called an all-staff huddle in the open floor area outside the main conference room, ostensibly to run through final logistics before the board arrived. 20-some employees gathered loosely in the space, some still holding coffee cups, most sensing, correctly, that this wasn't really about logistics at all. Vanessa stood at the front, blazer sharp, voice pitched for an audience larger than the one in front of her. She ran through a few genuine housekeeping notes, where the board would be seated, who would present which section, and then, almost as an afterthought, though it was clearly nothing of the sort, her eyes landed on Daniel, standing near the back with his hands in his pockets. "Actually," she said, letting the word hang in the air with theatrical timing, "while we're all here, I think it's time we talked about performance standards on this floor. Because some people, and her eyes didn't leave Daniel now, have been coasting for a while, showing up late to meetings, turning in work that needs to be redone, leaving early like the rest of us don't have lives too." A ripple of discomfort moved through the group. Priya's jaw tightened. Someone near the front shifted their weight, unsure where to look. Daniel felt his pulse pick up, not from fear exactly, but from the particular, cold clarity of recognizing a moment before it fully arrives. He said nothing. He'd learned, across 3 years of Vanessa's careless cruelty, that defending himself in these moments only gave her more to work with. "I think," Vanessa continued, and here her voice sharpened, deliberate now, aimed, "given that the board is walking through this office in less than 10 minutes. It would reflect very poorly on this division to have Daniel Reyes still on the floor. So, Daniel, I'm going to save us both the awkwardness. You're done here. Clean out your desk. I'll have HR send the paperwork." The room went silent in the specific way rooms go silent when everyone present understands they've just watched something cruel happen in public, and none of them have the courage to say so out loud. Priya's hand had gone to her mouth. Someone near the conference room door had actually stopped walking, mid-step, phone still raised halfway to check the time. Daniel stood very still. He could have said any number of things in that moment. He could have told her that firing an employee without cause, in front of witnesses, 10 minutes before a board visit, was not the display of decisive leadership she imagined it to be. He could have told her that the report she'd claimed to fix had never contained a single error. He could have told her a great many things. Instead, he simply nodded once, the way a man nods when he's already halfway somewhere else in his mind, and said, quietly enough that only the people nearest him could hear, "Understood." He turned and walked back toward his desk to gather his things, aware of the eyes following him, aware of the particular silence that trails behind public humiliation, and aware, more than anything else, of the small, cold detail Vanessa herself did not yet know. The board chair, the one calling this meeting, the one who had personally guided Claire's shares into the trust 3 years earlier, the one who had told Daniel just last week that its time was already in the building. He'd arrived early. He was, in fact, standing near the elevator bank at that exact moment, close enough to have heard every word Vanessa said. And in less than 2 minutes, he was going to walk onto that floor, look around the room full of nervous, silent employees, and ask a single question that would change everything Vanessa Cole thought she understood about the man she'd just fired. Daniel had barely reached his desk when he heard it. The elevator chime, the doors sliding open, and a voice, calm and unhurried, cutting through the tension of the room like it belonged there, far more than anyone else's did. "Where is he?" The voice belonged to Richard Alden, chairman of Meridian Logistics Board of Directors, a man whose face appeared on precisely one corporate document a year and nowhere else, by design. He stepped off the elevator flanked by two other board members, his expression unreadable, his eyes moving across the open floor with the particular calm of someone who already knew far more about this room than anyone standing in it. Vanessa, still riding the adrenaline of her own performance, turned toward him with the practiced brightness of someone eager to make a first impression. "Mr. Alden, welcome. We're just finishing up a few final preparations before." "Where is he?" Alden repeated, and this time the question was clearly not rhetorical. His eyes had stopped moving across the room and settled deliberately on the empty desk near the back, the one with a half-packed box sitting on top of it, a family photo, a child's drawing taped to the monitor, a jacket still hanging off the back of the chair. Vanessa's bright expression faltered just slightly, confusion cutting through her composure. "I'm sorry, who? Daniel Reyes." Alden said the name the way a person says a name they've said many times before, in rooms far more important than this one. "I was told he'd be here. I specifically arranged this visit around a conversation with him." The silence that followed was different from the silence after Vanessa's firing announcement minutes earlier. That silence had been uncomfortable, complicit. This one was something closer to vertigo. The collective, dawning sense of an entire room realizing the ground beneath them was not what they'd believed it to be. Vanessa started, and for the first time in 18 months on this floor, employees watched her search for words and fail to find the confident ones. He was let go. Just now. "Performance issues. I didn't realize he was. Is he expected for the review?" Alden's expression didn't shift into anger, not exactly. It shifted into something colder and more precise. The look of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the person standing in front of him. "Expected for the review," he repeated slowly. "Miss Cole, Daniel Reyes isn't attending this review as an employee. He owns 62% of this company. He has for 3 years. The words landed across the floor like a physical shift in air pressure. Priya's hand, still half raised near her mouth from moments earlier, froze completely. Someone near the conference room dropped a folder, papers scattering unnoticed across the floor. Vanessa's face went through a rapid, visible sequence. Confusion, disbelief, and then, as the meaning fully arrived, something close to horror. "That's..." She started, then stopped, then tried again, her voice smaller now than anyone on the floor had ever heard it. "That's not possible. He's an admin coordinator. He fills out shipping forms." He chose to," Alden said simply. "His late wife's family founded this company. When she passed, her shares came to him. He asked to work here quietly, from the ground floor, before ever stepping into a boardroom, to understand what this company actually feels like to work for, not just what it looks like on a quarterly earnings call." He paused, letting that settle fully before continuing, his voice gaining a harder edge. "Which means, Ms. Cole, that for the past 18 months, every decision you've made on this floor, every employee you've dismissed, mocked, or manipulated for your own visibility, he has watched, personally." Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. The confident posture that had carried her through the morning had entirely collapsed, replaced by something rigid and pale. At that moment, Daniel walked back onto the floor. He'd stopped in the hallway, box in hand, upon hearing his own name spoken by Alden's voice, and now stood at the edge of the open area, still holding the same half-packed box, still wearing the same faded jacket, looking, to anyone glancing quickly, exactly like the man Vanessa had fired 10 minutes earlier. But nobody in that room was glancing quickly anymore. "Daniel?" Alden's tone softened noticeably as he crossed the floor toward him, extending a hand. "I'm sorry you had to walk into this. I should have come up sooner." "It's all right," Daniel said, and his voice, for the first time that morning, carried a different weight. Not louder, not sharper, just entirely, unmistakably certain in a way it hadn't allowed itself to be in 3 years. "I think this needed to happen exactly the way it did." He turned, finally, to face Vanessa directly. The room watched, breath held collectively, as the woman who minutes earlier had announced his firing in front of the entire floor now stood frozen, unable to meet his eyes. "You said I was coasting," Daniel said. Not unkindly, not cruelly, but with the plain clarity of someone laying out facts that could no longer be argued with. "You said my work needed to be redone. You said I was an embarrassment in front of the board." He set the box down gently on the nearest desk. "The report I turned in this morning had 0 errors. You didn't fix anything. You reprinted it and told people you had, the same way you've told people a dozen other things over the past 1.5 years that weren't true. because you assumed no one would ever be in a position to say otherwise. Vanessa's lips parted, some protest half-forming, but nothing came out. Around the room, employees who had spent months watching her operate, who had absorbed her comments, adjusted their schedules around her moods, learned to stay quiet when she took credit that wasn't hers, were watching this unfold with expressions caught somewhere between shock and, unmistakably, a kind of long overdue relief. "I'm not telling you this to humiliate you," Daniel continued, his voice steady. "I'm telling you because for 18 months you built a version of leadership around who you could step on to look taller. And today you did it in front of the one person who was always going to find out." He glanced briefly at Alden, then back to Vanessa. "That's not bad luck. That's just what happens, eventually, when cruelty becomes a habit instead of an exception." Alden stepped forward then, addressing the room rather than Vanessa alone, his voice carrying the calm finality of someone who had clearly already decided how this would end before he ever stepped off the elevator. "Mrs. Cole, I'll need you to gather your things. HR will coordinate an exit review this afternoon. This conversation isn't happening in front of an audience by choice, but I think, given the last 10 minutes, it's fitting that it does." Vanessa's face had gone from pale to something closer to ash. She looked once around the room, at the faces of employees who, for the first time, were not looking away from her. And then, without another word, without the composed exit she might have scripted for herself under different circumstances, she turned and walked toward her office, the click of her heels against the floor sounding smaller, somehow, than it had all morning. Daniel watched her go, then turned back to the room full of coworkers still frozen in stunned silence, still processing the fact that the quiet man who packed his own lunch and left early for school pickups controlled the company that employed every single one of them. He didn't say anything grand. He simply picked the box back up off the desk, looked at it for a moment as though deciding whether he still needed it, and set it back down. "I think," he said quietly, "I'll actually keep my desk for now." The story of what happened on the 11th floor that Tuesday morning did not stay contained to the 11th floor for long. By the end of the day, it had traveled through every department at Meridian's headquarters, whispered between coworkers who hadn't witnessed it firsthand but had heard the details secondhand, then thirdhand, each retelling losing a little accuracy but none of its emotional weight. By the end of the week, it had become something closer to company folklore. The quiet admin coordinator, who turned out to be the man who owned the majority of the company, and the VP who fired him 10 minutes before finding out. Vanessa Cole's departure from Meridian was handled quietly by HR standards, but quiet didn't mean gentle. The exit review that afternoon uncovered more than her treatment of Daniel. Over the following weeks, as Alden and the board conducted a fuller review of her tenure, a pattern emerged that had apparently been invisible only to the people who hadn't been paying attention or who'd been too afraid to say anything while she held power over their positions. Multiple employees came forward once they understood it was finally safe to, with their own stories. Projects reassigned without credit, schedules manipulated to punish anyone who needed flexibility for family obligations. Performance reviews quietly altered to justify decisions she'd already made for other reasons. None of it, individually, had been enough to trigger action. Together, it painted a clear picture. Vanessa was let go with a severance package dictated by contract, not generosity, and Meridian's legal team made clear, through appropriate channels, that any attempt to frame her departure publicly as anything other than a performance-based termination would be met with a full and documented account of the internal review. She left the industry's regional network of contacts with a reputation that, unlike Daniel's, she'd built entirely on cruelty rather than substance, and reputations built that way rarely survive first contact with the truth. For Daniel, the weeks that followed required a recalibration he'd known, somewhere, was always coming, even if he hadn't let himself think too hard about the specifics. He couldn't simply return to his desk and continue processing shipping documentation, not once the entire building knew who he was. Alden and the rest of the board asked him, gently but directly, to step into a more formal role, not necessarily CEO, not immediately, but something that reflected the reality of his ownership stake and the responsibility that came with it. Daniel took 2 weeks to decide, during which he spent more time than usual sitting on his apartment balcony in the evenings after Emma had gone to bed, thinking about Claire, about the promise he'd made her, about what she'd actually meant when she told him he'd understand the company better from the bottom floor before he ever stood at the top of it. He understood now. He'd spent 3 years watching how power moved through Meridian, when the people wielding it assumed no one significant was watching. He'd seen which managers built loyalty through genuine respect and which ones built only fear disguised as authority. He'd seen, up close, exactly what kind of leadership made a workplace survivable and what kind made it something people endured rather than valued. Claire had been right. You cannot understand a company by reading its earnings reports. You understand it by standing where its employees stand, absorbing what they absorb, and deciding, once you finally have the power to change it, what kind of company you actually want to run. Daniel accepted a role as vice chair, working alongside Alden on strategic direction, but insisted on structuring it in a way that let him remain closely connected to the operational floor, rather than disappearing into an executive suite disconnected from daily reality. One of his first initiatives was a formal, anonymous feedback channel that let any employee at any level flag concerns about management behavior directly to the board, the kind of channel that, had it existed 18 months earlier, might have surfaced Vanessa's pattern of behavior long before it reached the point it did. He also made a point in his new role of personally reviewing every termination decision made across the logistics division for the following year, not to micromanage, but to ensure no employee was ever again let go in a hallway, in front of an audience, 10 minutes before a visit designed to make someone else look good. Priya, the analyst who'd sat near Daniel's desk for 3 years without ever knowing who he really was promoted to team lead within 2 months. A decisions made independently by the new interim VP, but one Daniel quietly noted with approval, having watched her competence and quiet integrity for longer than she realized. At home, very little actually changed, and that, more than anything, was the part of the story Daniel found himself most grateful for. Emma still lost her front teeth on schedule with the tooth fairy. Their evenings still ended with homework at the kitchen table and the same cartoon about the detective dog playing in the background. Daniel still made scrambled eggs most mornings, still left in time to be there when the school day ended, though now, when people learned his name, they occasionally reacted with a kind of startled recognition that made him faintly uncomfortable, a fame he'd never sought and still wasn't entirely sure how to wear. What he'd sought all along was simply to keep the promise he'd made to Claire, to see the company she loved from every angle before deciding what to do with the responsibility she'd left him. He hadn't set out to expose Vanessa Cole. He hadn't spent 3 years quietly building toward a dramatic reveal. He'd simply lived honestly inside a role most people assumed was beneath someone of his supposed status, and let the truth surface on its own timeline, in its own way, exactly as Claire had somehow known it eventually would. The story that spread through Meridian, and eventually beyond it, into industry circles and, briefly, into a few local business publications curious about the quiet ownership structure behind a billion-dollar logistics firm, tended to focus on the drama of the moment, the firing, the reveal, the swift and public reckoning. But the detail that stayed with the people who'd actually been in that room, the ones who watched it unfold in real time, wasn't the reveal itself. It was the quiet, steady way Daniel had absorbed a 1.5 years of casual cruelty without ever once trying to leverage the power he held to make anyone feel small in return, even in the moment when he finally could have. He never once, in the aftermath, gave an interview about what happened. He never posted about it, never let the story become a personal brand, never used it as leverage for anything beyond what it plainly was. A workplace, finally, becoming a little more honest about how it treated the people inside it. Maybe that's the part worth sitting with, longer than the shock of the reveal itself. It's easy to imagine that power, once revealed, should be used to settle every score, to humiliate in return exactly what was once dealt out. Daniel chose something quieter and, in its own way, far more difficult, using what he'd been given not to punish, but to make sure the next person standing where he once stood, in a faded jacket at a desk nobody looked at twice, would never have to endure what he did. How many people, in how many offices, are being underestimated right now by someone who has no idea who they're really looking at? And what would change, in workplaces everywhere, if just a few more people in power chose to lead the way Daniel did, quietly, patiently, and only when it truly mattered?